Hey, welcome to Campfire. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? I love knowing who's still with me, following every eerie twist. Drop a comment, get cozy, and let's begin. I've never told this story properly before. Not to my wife, not to my mates down the pub, certainly not to police when they ask their questions afterwards. But tonight, with the rain hammering against my windows just like it did that night 3 years ago, I reckon it's time someone heard the truth about what happened in Lolo National Forest. You ever been camping alone? I mean properly alone, miles from the nearest road, where your mobile's got no signal, and the only sounds are what nature decides to make. I used to love it. Used to. There's something about the solitude that strips everything away, all the noise of modern life, all the distractions. Just you and the wilderness, testing yourself against something bigger and older than civilization. I was working for a consulting firm back then, flying all over the states for various projects. Bloody exhausting it was. Hotels every night, rental cars, airport food. So whenever I had a few days between jobs, I'd hire a car and find somewhere wild to pitch my tent. Reset my head, Get back to something real. Montana had been on my list for years. Big sky country, they call it. And Christ, they're not wrong. I'd wrapped up a job in Seattle and had 4 days before I needed to be in Denver. So I drove east through the mountains, following the interstate until I reached Missoula. From there, it was a short drive south to Lolo National Forest. Have you ever seen forests like that? Dense, ancient pines stretching up mountainsides that seem to go on forever, with valleys so deep and shadowed they look like they've never seen proper sunlight. The kind of place that makes you feel small, reminds you that for all our technology and cities, we're still just another species trying to survive in something vast and indifferent. I'd done my research, naturally, found a trail that led about 8 miles into backcountry, to a small lake called Mirror Lake, though it wasn't on any of the tourist maps. Perfect, I thought. No day trippers. No families with screaming children. Just me and the wilderness. The weather forecast had mentioned possible showers, but nothing serious. Light rain, they said, should clear by evening. I camped in worse. And besides, there's something rather poetic about the sound of rain on canvas, isn't there? Nature's own white noise. I parked at the trailhead around noon, on a Tuesday in late September. The car park was empty except for an old pickup truck that looked like it hadn't moved in weeks. Rust eating through the wheel wells, spider webs strung between the mirrors and doors. Probably belonged to a hunter who'd abandoned it there. Happens more often than you'd think in places like that. The trail started easy enough, a well-marked path through lodgepole pines and Douglas firs. But after the first mile, it began to climb, switchbacking up a steep slope that had my legs burning and my lungs working hard in the thin mountain air. The trees grew thicker as I climbed, their canopy blocking out more and more the afternoon sky, until I was walking in a perpetual twilight. You know how silence can have weight to it? That's what I noticed first. Not the absence of sound. There were birds calling, branches creaking, my boots crunching on fallen needles, but the quality of the quiet underneath it all, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I reached Mirror Lake around 4:30. It was perfect, exactly what I'd hoped for. A small, dark lake maybe 200 yards across, ringed by towering pines and granite outcroppings. The water was so still it looked like black glass, reflecting the trees and the strip of gray sky visible overhead. I could see why they called it Mirror Lake. I set up camp on a small clearing about 50 yards from the shore, far enough back to avoid any animals that might come down to drink during the night. My tent was a good one, a 3-season mountain tent I'd used all over Europe, waterproof, wind-resistant, and big enough for me and my gear without feeling cramped. By the time I had everything sorted, tent pitched, sleeping bag laid out, food organized, the light was beginning to fade. That's when the first drop started. Just a few at first, pattering on the leaves above me, then gradually building to a steady rhythm. I smiled to myself as I lit my camp stove and put water on for tea. Perfect timing. I'd be snug and dry while the forest got its drink. The rain grew heavier as darkness fell. Not a torrential downpour, but persistent, soaking rain that drummed steadily on my tent fly and dripped from every branch and needle. I sat in my tent's vestibule with a cup of tea, watching the lake disappear into darkness, listening to the rain's hypnotic rhythm. That's when I first noticed something was wrong. You've been in wild places at night, haven't you? There's usually some ambient sound. Owls calling, small animals rustling through the undergrowth, the distant splash of a fish jumping. But as the rain settled into its steady pattern, I realized I couldn't hear anything else. No birds, no small creatures, nothing. Just the rain and, occasionally, the creak of trees swaying the wind. I told myself it was normal. Animals shelter during rain, wait it out. But something about the silence felt deliberate, like everything in the forest had decided to stop and listen. I finished my tea and retreated fully into my tent. I had a good book with me, something about the history of exploration in the American West, and my headlamp provided plenty of light for reading. But I found myself pausing every few pages, listening to the rain, trying to identify other sounds beneath it. Around 10 o'clock, I heard something that made my heart skip. A branch snapping. Not the natural creak and sway of trees and wind, but the sharp crack of wood breaking under weight. It came from across the lake, maybe 100 yards away, but in the stillness it sounded close enough to touch. I switched off my headlamp and listened. The rain continued its steady patter, but underneath it, I swear I could hear something moving. Slow, deliberate movement through the undergrowth. Too heavy to be a deer or elk. Too rhythmic to be accidental. I waited in the darkness for maybe 10 minutes, barely breathing, straining to hear. But whatever it was, if there had been anything at all, went quiet. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been a branch falling naturally, weakened by the rain. Happens all the time in old forests. I switched my light back on and tried to return to my book, but the words wouldn't stick. Every few minutes, I'd pause and listen, but there was nothing except rain. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I settled into my sleeping bag. You know that state between waking and sleeping, where you're conscious enough to hear what's around you but too tired to properly process it. That's where I was when I heard the footsteps. They started at the far side of the lake. Slow, measured steps on wet ground, moving along the shoreline. I came fully awake in an instant, my heart hammering against my ribs. I lay perfectly still, listening. The steps were definitely footsteps, not the irregular gait of an animal, but the steady rhythm of someone walking deliberately through the forest. They moved slowly around the lake's perimeter, getting gradually closer to my campsite. I wanted to unzip my tent and look out, but something kept me frozen in my sleeping bag. Some primal instinct that said movement meant danger, that staying still and hidden was my only chance. The footsteps stopped directly across the lake from me. I couldn't see anything. My tent was designed to block light from inside, but I could feel a presence there in the darkness. Watching, waiting. Minutes passed. The rain continued, but the footsteps had stopped. I lay there barely breathing, every muscle tensed, waiting for what? I didn't know. Then I heard something that nearly stopped my heart entirely. A voice calling across the water. Hello? It was a man's voice, but there was something wrong with it. Too loud, like he was projecting for an audience. And something else, an odd quality I couldn't quite place. It didn't sound quite natural. I know you're there, the voice called. I can see your tent. My blood went cold. From where I was camped, my tent shouldn't be visible from the other side of the lake, not in the darkness. The trees were too thick, the angle too acute. I forced myself to remain perfectly still. Don't respond, I told myself. Don't make a sound. I'm lost, the voice continued. Been walking for hours. Could use some help. There was something about the way he said it. Too casual, too friendly, like an actor reading lines. The kind of voice someone might use to lure a child into a car. The footsteps started again, continuing around the lake toward my side. Slow, deliberate, never hurrying. I could track his progress by the sound. 50 yards away, then 40, then 30. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The footsteps were perfectly regular, like someone marching to a metronome. No human walks like that naturally, especially not through rough terrain in the dark and rain. 20 yards away now, I could hear branches being pushed aside, water squelching underfoot. In a few minutes, he'd reach my campsite. I very slowly reached for the knife I kept clipped to the inside of my tent. It wasn't much, just a folding blade maybe 3 inches long. But it was something. My fingers closed around it, and I felt slightly less helpless. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting. Where was he? How close? I couldn't tell anymore. The rain seemed to muffle and distort everything. Then I heard something that nearly made me cry out. The metallic whisper of my tent's zipper being slowly drawn down. Someone was opening my tent from the outside. I gripped my knife and prepared to fight, but the zipper stopped after just a few inches. Through the gap, I could see nothing but blackness, but I could feel someone there just beyond the fabric, listening, waiting. I know you're awake, the voice whispered, so close now that it seemed to be right inside my tent. I can hear your heart beating. That's when I realized what was wrong with the voice. It was too clear, too precise, like someone speaking into a microphone, with no natural variation in tone or volume, like a recording. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Him just outside my tent, me frozen inside with my pathetic little knife. The rain continued its relentless drumming, but everything else was silence. Then, slowly, the zipper began to close again. I heard the footsteps resume, moving away from my tent back toward the lake. I lay there trembling, not daring to move, until the sounds faded entirely. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I lay in my sleeping bag with my knife in my hand, listening to every sound the forest made, jumping at every branch that creaked or twig that snapped. The rain began to ease around dawn, tapering off to occasional drops, and finally I heard what I'd been desperately waiting for, birds beginning to sing. When gray light finally began to filter through my tent, I worked up the courage to look outside. I unzipped the fly just an inch and peered out. The campsite looked exactly as I'd left it. No footprints in the soft earth, no disturbed vegetation, no sign that anyone had been there at all. Even the area around my tent, where I was certain someone had stood just hours before, showed no trace of disturbance. I might have convinced myself it had all been a dream, some kind of altitude-induced hallucination. except for one thing. My tent's rain fly, which I carefully staked down the evening before, was untied on one side. The corner nearest the lake hung loose, flapping slightly in the morning breeze. I packed up in record time, not bothering with breakfast or even a proper cup of tea. I just wanted out of there, back to the car, back to civilization, and mobile phone signals and other people. The hike out seemed longer than the hike in, even though it was mostly downhill. I kept looking over my shoulder, certain I was being followed, but the trail behind me was always empty. Just trees and shadows and the lingering smell of rain. When I finally reached the car park, the old pickup truck was gone. I drove straight to Missoula without stopping, found the first decent hotel I could, and spent the rest of the day in my room with the door locked and the television on for company. I told myself I'd been spooked by nothing, a combination of isolation, altitude, and overactive imagination. These things happen when you spend too much time alone in wild places. But that night, safe in my hotel room with traffic outside and people in the corridors and all the normal sounds of civilization, I found myself thinking about that voice, the artificial quality of it, the perfect regularity of those footsteps. And I remembered something I had read years ago about people who go missing in national forests. There are more disappearances in America's wilderness areas than anyone likes to talk about publicly. Thousands of people every year, vanishing without a trace in places like Yosemite, Yellowstone, the Great Smoky Mountains. Some are found eventually, usually dead, often in places that make no sense, as if they've been moved there. But many are never found at all. The official explanations are always the same: exposure, wildlife attacks, falls, getting lost. But there are patterns that don't fit those explanations. Clusters of disappearances in specific areas. Missing persons found miles from where they should have been, with no memory of how they got there. Strange sounds reported by other campers in the days before someone vanishes. I started researching Lolo National Forest specifically. What I found made my blood run cold. Over the past 15 years, at least a dozen people had gone missing in that area. All experienced outdoors people, all camping alone, all last seen heading toward the more remote areas of the forest. 3 had been found dead in impossible locations. One at the bottom of a ravine he couldn't possibly have reached from his planned route. Another sitting peacefully beside a lake 12 miles from his campsite, apparently dead from hypothermia despite warm weather. The rest had simply vanished. And in several cases, other campers reported hearing voices in the night before the disappearances. Voices calling for help, claiming to be lost. Voices that didn't sound quite right. I never went back to Montana. I never went camping alone again. Actually, something about that night in Lolo Forest changed me, made me understand that there are places in this world where we don't belong, where something else is in charge. Places where the rules we think we understand don't apply. You're probably wondering why I'm telling you this now, 3 years later. Why tonight, with the rain coming down just like it did that night by Mirror Lake? It's because of what happened today. I was at work, just finishing up some reports, when my phone rang. Unknown number, American area code. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. There was silence on the line for a moment, then a voice I recognized spoke. The same artificial, too perfect voice I'd heard across that dark lake. "Hello," it said. "I know you're there. I can see you." I hung up immediately, my hand shaking. But the phone rang again within seconds. Same number. I let it go to voicemail. When I played the message back, there was just breathing for 30 seconds. Then that voice again. "I'm lost. Been looking for you for years. Could use some help." The phone's been ringing all evening. Same number, same message. I've stopped answering, but it keeps ringing. And each time, the voice sounds a little clearer, a little closer. I'm sitting here now in my flat in London, 3,000 miles from Lolo National Forest, listening to the rain against my windows and wondering how something I left behind in those dark woods has found me here, wondering what it wants, what it's been waiting for all this time. The phone's ringing again now. I can see the glow of the screen across the room, but I'm not going to answer. I'm going to sit here with my tea and wait for morning and hope that whatever followed me back from that lake decides to give up and leave me be. But I can hear something else now, underneath the rain. Footsteps outside my building. Slow, measured steps on wet pavement. The same mechanical rhythm I heard that night by Mirror Lake. And I think they're getting closer. If you ever find yourself camping alone in wild places, particularly in America's national forests, let me give you some advice. If you hear voices in the night, voices calling for help or claiming to be lost, don't answer. Don't help. Don't even acknowledge that you've heard them. Some things that get lost in the wilderness are meant to stay lost. The footsteps have stopped now. Right outside my building, I think, but my phone's still ringing, and when I look at the screen, I can see something that makes my heart stop. The caller ID doesn't show a number anymore. It shows a location. Mirror Lake, Lolo National Forest. 3,000 miles away, but somehow right outside my door. I suppose some distances can't be measured in miles. The phone stopped ringing now. Everything's gone quiet except for the rain. But I can feel something watching me from the darkness outside. Something that's been looking for me for 3 years and has finally found what it was seeking. I don't think I'm going to see morning. I'm recording this because I need to get out of my head. Need someone else to hear what happened to me in Lolo National Forest last October. The doctors say it's post-traumatic stress, that my mind is filling in gaps with false memories to cope with whatever trauma I experienced out there. But I know what I remember, and I know what I don't remember. And the gap between those two things is what terrifies me most. You ever lost time? I don't mean falling asleep and waking up confused about what day it is. I mean having 3 whole days just gone, vanished. Like someone reached into your life and carefully cut out a piece, leaving you with a before and after, but nothing in between. I was meant to be camping for 5 days. 5 days of hiking, fishing, maybe a bit of photography in one of America's most beautiful wilderness areas. I'd been planning it for months, looking forward to getting away from the noise and stress of my job in London. I work in finance. You see, long hours, constant pressure, the sort of work that grinds you down until you forget what quiet sounds like. Montana had always called to me. Something about those vast spaces, those endless skies. I'd done my research, studied the maps, picked out a route that would take me deep into the backcountry where I could truly disconnect. No mobile signal, no internet, no reminders of the world I'd left behind. I flew into Missoula on a Tuesday evening in late October. The trees were just starting to turn, brilliant yellows and oranges scattered among the evergreens like flames against dark canvas. I spent the night in a cheap motel near the airport, going over my route one last time, checking my gear, try to calm the nervous excitement that always came before a big solo trip. The weather forecast was mixed, clear for the first 2 days, then a storm system moving in that could bring heavy rain, and possibly even early snow at higher elevations. Perfect, I thought. I'd have time to get established, find good shelter, then hunker down and enjoy the storm from inside my tent. Wednesday morning, I drove the rental car to the Lolo Pass area, and found the trailhead I'd marked on my map. It was a lesser-known trail that led to a series of alpine lakes about 15 miles into the wilderness, the sort of place you had to work to reach, which meant I'd likely have it entirely to myself. The car park was empty except for my rental. A good sign. I shouldered my pack, maybe 40 pounds of gear, food, and water, and set off into the forest just after 9 in the morning. Have you ever noticed how different American wilderness feels from anything we have in Britain? It's the scale of it, partly. These forests go on for hundreds of miles, stretching over mountain ranges that dwarf our highest peaks. But it's something else too, a quality of wildness that feels older, less touched by human presence. Walking into that forest felt like stepping back in time, into a world where humans were still just another species trying to survive. The first day's hiking was glorious. The trail climbed steadily through dense stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, with occasional clearings that offered stunning views across valley after valley of unbroken forest. The air was crisp and clean, scented with pine and the earthy smell of autumn leaves. I stopped frequently to take photos, to just stand and listen to the profound quiet that only exists in places like that. I made camp that first night beside a small creek, maybe 8 miles in from trailhead, set up my tent on a flat spot among the trees, cooked a simple meal on my camp stove, then sat by the water as darkness fell, listening to its gentle murmur and watching the first stars appear through the canopy overhead. I slept deeply that night. The kind of sleep you only get in the wilderness, where the absence of artificial light and electronic noise allows your body to remember its natural rhythms. I woke at dawn feeling more rested than I had in months. The second day took me higher into the mountains, following a fainter trail that switched back up steep slopes and along narrow ridges. The trees began to thin as I gained elevation, giving way to alpine meadows dotted with small lakes that reflected the sky like scattered mirrors. That's where I was heading, to the largest of these lakes, marked on my map as Phantom Lake. Remote, beautiful, and supposedly excellent for brook trout. I reached it around mid-afternoon on Thursday, and it was everything I'd hoped for. The lake sat in natural bowls surrounded by granite peaks, their slopes covered in golden aspen and dark spruce. The water was so clear I could see the bottom 20 feet down, and fish were already rising to feed on insects in the shallows. I found a perfect campsite on a small peninsula that jutted into the lake, offering views in 3 directions and protection from the wind. I set up my tent, organized my gear, then spent the rest of the afternoon fishing. The trout were eager, beautiful native brookies with bright orange fins and spotted flanks. I kept 2 for dinner and released the rest, then cooked them over a small fire as the sun set behind the peaks. That's the last clear memory I have for 3 days. I mean that literally. I remember sitting by my fire Thursday evening, watching the flames dance while the lake turned silver in the moonlight. I remember thinking how perfect it all was, how this was exactly what I needed. And then, nothing. The next thing I remember with any clarity is waking up in my tent on Monday morning. Not Sunday, Monday. 3 full days and nights just gone. At first, I thought I'd simply slept deeply. You know how it is when you're truly relaxed, when your body finally gets the rest it's been craving. But as I became more fully awake, I realized something was wrong. My sleeping bag was soaking wet, though my tent seemed dry. My clothes, the ones I'd been wearing Thursday evening, were muddy and torn, as if I'd been hiking through rough terrain. My boots were caked with mud and what looked like ash, though I couldn't remember letting my fire burn down that far. But it was the state of my campsite that really unsettled me. My gear was scattered about, not carelessly, but systematically. like someone had gone through everything methodically, examining each item before setting it aside. My food was nearly gone. 5 days' worth of supplies reduced to maybe 1 day's rations. And my camera was missing entirely. I searched everywhere for that camera. It had been sitting right beside my tent Thursday evening, loaded with photos from the first 2 days of hiking. Gone. Not just misplaced, gone, as if it had never existed. The strangest thing, though, was my notebook. I always keep a journal when I'm camping. Just simple notes about the weather, what I've seen, how I'm feeling. The last entry I remember writing was Thursday evening. But when I found the notebook, there were 3 more entries after that, all in my handwriting, but different somehow. The words were mine, but I had no memory of writing them. Friday. Follow the lights deeper into the forest. They want to show me something. Saturday. The others are kind. They've been waiting so long for someone to understand. Sunday. Going home tomorrow. They say I won't remember, but I'll know. Deep down, I'll always know. I stared at those entries for a long time, trying to trigger some memory, some fragment of what had happened. But there was nothing, just a blank space where 3 days of my life should have been. The rational part of my mind, the London finance worker who dealt in facts and figures, tried to make sense of it. Maybe I'd had some kind of breakdown, a stress-induced episode where I'd wandered around the forest in a dissociative state. Maybe I'd hit my head, suffered a concussion that had affected my memory. These things happen, especially to people pushing themselves alone in challenging environments. But that explanation didn't account for everything. It didn't explain why my food was gone, but I felt neither hungry nor full. It didn't explain the mud on my boots when the ground around my campsite was dry. And it certainly didn't explain the other things I found as I broke camp that Monday morning. There were tracks around my tent. Not animal tracks. I knew those well enough. These were different. Humanoid but wrong somehow. Too long and narrow, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. They circled my campsite in a perfect spiral, starting from the lake shore and ending at my tent door. And there were objects scattered about that didn't belong to me. Small things, easily missed if you weren't looking carefully. Smooth stones arranged in geometric patterns. Branches bent into impossible shapes and woven together like some kind of primitive art. And everywhere, a smell I couldn't identify, not unpleasant, but strange. Like ozone after lightning, mixed with something organic and earthy. I packed up quickly, more unsettled than I cared to admit. The rational thing would have been to hike out immediately, get back to civilization, maybe see a doctor about the memory loss. But something made me hesitate. As I shouldered my pack and prepared to leave, I looked back at Phantom Lake one more time. The morning sun was just catching the water, turning it into a sheet of gold. And for just a moment, I could swear I saw movement beneath the surface. Not fish, something larger, more deliberate. Shapes that moved too purposefully to be natural, too coordinated to be random. I blinked, and the lake was empty again. Just clear water reflecting the sky. The hike out took most of the day. I was weaker than I should have been, tired in a way that suggested I'd been active during those missing days, even though I had no memory of it. Several times I had to stop and rest, something that wasn't like me at all. But the strangest thing was the trail itself. I was certain I'd memorized the route in, could have walked it blindfolded, but now it seemed different. Turns that should have been there weren't. Landmarks I remembered were in the wrong places. It was as if the forest had rearranged itself while I wasn't looking. I eventually found my way back to the car park, though it took longer than it should have. The rental car was still there, covered in a layer of frosted spite, the mild weather. When I checked the odometer, it showed I'd driven an extra 47 miles since parking there. But the fuel gauge showed the tank was still full. The drive back to Missoula was a blur. I kept catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Shapes flitting between the trees, shadows that moved against the light. But every time I looked directly, there was nothing there. I spent that night in the same motel, trying to make sense of what had happened. I called the airline, changed my flight to leave the next morning instead of Thursday as originally planned. I just wanted to get home, get back to familiar surroundings where I could think clearly. But even now, 3 months later, I can't stop thinking about those missing days. The dream started almost immediately after I returned to London. Not nightmares exactly, but strange, vivid dreams filled with impossible landscapes and beings that seem almost human but not quite. In the dreams, I'm walking through a forest that's like Lolo but not Lolo. The trees are taller, older, their branches intertwining overhead to form a living cathedral. And I'm not alone. There are others with me, figures I can never quite see clearly, but whose presence feels familiar, comforting even. They're trying to tell me something, these dream figures, something important. But I always wake up before I can understand what it is, left with only fragments and impressions that fade like morning mist. I've been back to doctors since then, neurologists, psychiatrists, specialists in memory disorders. They've run every test they can think of, MRIs, blood work, psychological evaluations. Everything comes back normal. No sign of head injury, no indication of any medical condition that might cause memory loss. One doctor suggested I might have been drugged somehow, though she couldn't explain by whom or how in the middle of the wilderness. Another thought it might be a rare form of dissociative disorder triggered by the isolation and stress. But none of their explanations felt right. The truth is, I don't think I want to remember what happened during those 3 days. There's something inside me, some deep instinct, that says forgetting might be a mercy. But at the same time, I can't shake the feeling that whatever happened was important. Life-changing in a way I don't yet understand. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself looking up flights to Montana, planning another trip to Lolo, telling myself I need to go back, need to find answers. But then morning comes and rational thought returns, and I convince myself to let it go. But tonight is different. Tonight, with the rain drumming against my windows just like it did in my dreams of that impossible forest, I can feel something calling me back. A pull I can't resist much longer. You see, there was one other thing I found when I was packing up that Monday morning. Something I haven't told anyone about, not even the doctors. It was in my jacket pocket. A smooth, black stone about the size of a robin's egg. I'd never seen it before, had no memory of picking it up, but when I held it, just for a moment, I could almost remember. Faces in the darkness, voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. A sense of belonging, of being welcomed into something ancient and vast and wonderful. The stone is sitting on my desk now as I record this. It's warm to the touch, warmer than it should be, and sometimes I swear I can hear something coming from inside it. Not a sound exactly, but a vibration, a rhythm like a heartbeat. I've been carrying it with me everywhere for 3 months now. My little piece of those missing days, my only connection to whatever happened at Phantom Lake. And tonight, for the first time since I've been back, it's starting to glow, just faintly, like embers in dying fire, but definitely glowing. And as I watch it, I can feel those lost memories stirring at the edges of my consciousness, trying to surface, trying to make themselves known. Part of me is terrified of remembering, but another part, a larger part, is desperate to know, to understand what I found in that wilderness, or what found me. The stone is getting brighter now. The rain outside is getting heavier, and somewhere in the sound of water against glass, I can hear voices calling, familiar voices, speaking that impossible language I somehow understand. They're telling me it's time to come home. I think I'm going to book that flight to Montana after all, not because I want answers anymore, but because I'm finally ready to accept what I've always known deep down. Those weren't 3 days I lost in Lolo National Forest. They were 3 days I found something else. Something that's been waiting patiently ever since for me to remember, to return, to embrace what I've become. The stone is blazing now, bright enough to read by, and in its light, I can finally see my hands clearly. They're not quite the same hands I had before I went to Montana. The fingers are longer, more graceful. The nails are sharper, and they're just visible beneath the skin are patterns that look almost like scales. I think it's time to go back to Phantom Lake, back to whatever's waiting for me in that impossible forest, back home. I need to tell someone about this before I lose my nerve entirely, before I start doubting my own sanity more than I already am. What happened to me in Lolo National Forest 6 weeks ago has left me questioning everything I thought I knew about reality, about identity, about what it means to be me. You ever looked in a mirror and had that moment where you don't quite recognize the person staring back? Just for a split second, your reflection seems like a stranger wearing your face? That feeling of disconnect, of something being not quite right? Well, imagine that feeling lasting for weeks, growing stronger every day, until you're not sure which version of yourself is real anymore. I'm a photographer by trade. Freelance work mostly, nature and wildlife stuff for magazines and tourism boards. It's solitary work, which suits me perfectly. Always has. I prefer the company of forests and mountains of people. Find more honesty in a sunrise over a lake than in most human conversation. Last September, I got commissioned to do a series on America's hidden wilderness areas. Places off the beaten track. The sort of locations that don't make it into the glossy tourist brochures, but showcase the raw, untamed beauty that still exists if you know where to look. Lolo National Forest in Montana was top of my list. I'd heard about it from other photographers. Vast, largely unexplored, with terrain that ranged from dense old-growth forest to alpine lakes that hadn't been properly mapped. Perfect for what I needed. Remote enough that I wouldn't run into crowds of tourists. Wild enough to provide the kind of dramatic landscapes that make editors sit up and take notice. I flew into Missoula on a Friday evening in late September. Spent the weekend checking my gear and studying topographical maps. The weather forecast looked promising. Clear skies for the next week. Temperatures mild enough for comfortable camping, but cool enough to avoid the insects that can make wilderness photography a misery. Monday morning, I drove out to one of the lesser-known trailheads, a dirt road that ended at what was barely more than a footpath leading into the forest. Perfect. No facilities, no markers, no signs of other visitors. Just me, my cameras, and several thousand acres of pristine wilderness. I'd planned a circular route that would take me 5 days, deep into the backcountry, up to the alpine zone, then back out via a different trail. I was carrying about 50 pounds of gear, including 3 camera bodies, 6 lenses, a sturdy tripod, and enough supplies to keep me comfortable and well-fed. The first day's hiking was exactly what I'd hoped for. Ancient pines that must have been centuries old. Their trunks so wide I couldn't have wrapped my arms around them. shafts of golden sunlight slanting through the canopy, illuminating patches of forest floor carpeted with fallen needles. I shot 3 rolls of film before I'd even covered 5 miles. Yes, film. I know it's old-fashioned, but there's something about the process, the deliberation, the inability to delete and reshoot endlessly, that forces you to really see what you're capturing. Digital has its place, but for serious landscape work, nothing beats the depth and richness of proper film. I made camp that first night beside a small meadow, maybe 8 miles from the trailhead. Set up my tent on level ground. Cooked a simple meal, then sat outside as darkness fell, planning the next day's shots. The silence was profound. No traffic, no aircraft, no human sounds at all. Just the whisper of wind in the trees and the distant call of an owl. I slept deeply and woke before dawn, eager to catch the sunrise. There's something magical about first light in a forest. The way it filters through the trees, creating layers of shadow and illumination that change by the minute. I set up my camera on the tripod and waited, watching the darkness gradually give way to gray, then gold. That's when I first saw him. Another photographer, maybe 50 yards away across the meadow, setting up his own shot. I could make out the silhouette of a tripod, the distinctive shape of a large format camera. My heart sank a little. I'd chosen this remote location specifically to avoid other people, and here was someone else with the exact same idea. But as the light improved and I could see more clearly, something odd struck me. The other photographer's setup looked remarkably similar to mine. Same style of tripod, same type of camera bag, even what appeared to be the same jacket. I was wearing a distinctive red and black mountain parka I bought specifically for this trip. I raised my hand in greeting, the universal acknowledgement between photographers sharing a location. He raised his hand back, the gesture perfectly mirrored. Then he seemed to melt back into the forest, disappearing among the trees before I could get a better look at him. I didn't think much of it at the time. Coincidences happen, and serious photographers often end up with similar gear and clothing. Good equipment is good equipment. After all, I finished my sunrise shots and started breaking camp, eager to push deeper into the wilderness. The second day took me higher into mountains, following a faint trail that switchbacked up steep slopes covered in dense forest. The trees began to change as I gained elevation. Fewer of the massive old-growth pines, more spruce and fir adapted to the thinner air and shorter growing season. I was moving slowly, stopping frequently to photograph interesting compositions. A dead tree silhouetted against the sky, its bare branches creating natural sculpture. Morning mist rising from a hidden valley. The interplay of light and shadow on granite outcroppings that thrust up through the forest like ancient monuments. Around midday, I stopped for lunch at a small clearing that offered views back down the valley I climbed. As I sat eating my sandwich and reviewing the morning shots, I noticed movement in the forest below. Another hiker, maybe half a mile behind me, following the same trail. Even at that distance, something about the figure looked familiar. The same red and black jacket, the same purposeful but unhurried pace I recognized from my own hiking style. I watched through my telephoto lens as the figure stopped at almost exactly the same spots where I'd stopped to take photographs, setting up what appeared to be identical shots. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. This wasn't coincidence anymore. Someone was following me, copying my route, even duplicating my photographic subjects. But why? And how had they known where I was planning to go? I packed up quickly and continued climbing, pushing myself harder than I normally would. I wanted to reach my planned campsite well before this other photographer, to confront them if necessary, and find out what their game was. The trail grew steeper and more challenging as the afternoon wore on. Several times I had to scramble over fallen logs or navigate around washouts where spring snowmelt had carved new channels down the mountainside. But I kept pushing, driven by a growing sense of unease about my shadow. I reached the alpine zone just as the sun was beginning to set. The trees thinned out here, giving way to rocky slopes dotted with hardy alpine plants and small jewel-like lakes. I'd been planning to camp beside the largest of these lakes, a pristine body of water that reflected the surrounding peaks like a natural mirror. I found the perfect spot, a level area with good drainage, protected from wind but with clear views across the lake for sunrise photography. I set up my tent quickly, then prepared a hot meal as darkness fell, and the first stars appeared in the crystal clear mountain air. That's when I heard the other tent being set up. The sound came from across the lake, maybe 200 yards away. The distinctive rustle of nylon, the metallic clink of tent poles being assembled. Someone else had reached the same lake, chosen a campsite almost directly opposite mine. I switched on my headlamp and tried to peer across the water, but the light didn't carry far enough to make out details. All I could see was the faint glow of another light source, a headlamp or torch, moving around a campsite that seemed to mirror my own. I called out across the water, "Hello, beautiful spot, isn't it?" The other light stopped moving. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then a voice came back across the lake, carrying clearly in the still night air. "Hello, beautiful spot, isn't it?" The exact same words, in the exact same tone, like an echo, but delayed too long to be natural sound reflection. And something about the voice itself was wrong, too similar to my own, as if someone was doing a very good impression of me. I tried again. "I'm James. Are you camping here long?" Again, that pause. Then, "I'm James. Are you camping here long?" My blood ran cold. This wasn't conversation. It was mimicry. Someone was repeating everything I said word for word, in a voice that sounded disturbingly like my own. I switched off my headlamp and sat in darkness, watching the other light continue to move around the distant campsite. Every few minutes, it would pause, and I had the unsettling feeling that whoever was carrying it was looking directly at me across the dark water. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound seemed amplified. The gentle lap of water against the shore, the creak of my tent in the slight breeze, the distant call of night birds, and underneath it all, the knowledge that someone was out there in the darkness, someone who seemed to know far too much about me. I woke before dawn, as I always do when I'm camping. The other campsite was quiet, no light visible. I set up my camera gear as quietly as possible, hoping to catch the sunrise without attracting attention from my mysterious neighbor. But as the light began to grow, I could see the other campsite clearly. There was a tent there, almost identical to mine. The same color, the same size, set up in exactly the same configuration. And beside it, a tripod with a camera already mounted and pointed toward the sunrise, toward the exact same composition I was preparing to photograph. As I watched, a figure emerged from the tent. Even at that distance, the similarity was unmistakable. Same height, same build, same red and black jacket. The figure moved with my mannerisms, set up their shot with my methodical precision. I had to see who this was. I broke down my own gear and started around the lake, moving as quietly as possible. But the terrain was rough, and it took me nearly 20 minutes to work my way around to the other campsite. When I arrived, there was no one there. The tent was gone. The tripod was gone. There was no sign that anyone had ever camped there. No disturbed ground. No ashes from a fire, no footprints in the soft earth beside the lake. It was as if the entire campsite had been an illusion, but there was something, a single item left behind, sitting on a flat rock exactly where the tent had been. One of my lens caps, the distinctive red and white cap from my 85mm lens. The one I'd noticed was missing the day before. I checked my camera bag frantically. The cap was there, securely attached to the lens where it belonged. But here was another one, identical in every way, sitting in a place where someone who looked exactly like me had been camping. I picked up the duplicate lens cap with shaking hands. It was real, solid, warm from the morning sun. And on the inside, written in my own handwriting, were my initials, JM, James Morrison. But I'd never written my initials inside a lens cap. I'd never owned two caps for the same lens. I stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of what was happening. The rational part of my mind suggested explanations. Another photographer with similar gear, coincidental similarities, perhaps some kind of elaborate prank. But the evidence didn't support rational explanations. The duplicate lens cap went into my pocket, and I spent the rest of the morning photographing the lake and surrounding peaks. But my heart wasn't in it. Every shot felt like I was going through motions, copying someone else's work rather than creating my own. That afternoon, I decided to cut the trip short. I packed up early and started hiking back down the mountain, following a different trail than the one I'd used to come up. I wanted to avoid any chance of another encounter with my doppelganger. But as I descended through the forest, I kept catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, always just out of direct sight, always disappearing when I turned to look. And twice, I could have sworn I heard the distant sound of a camera shutter, the same distinctive click on my own Hasselblad. I pushed myself hard, hiking faster than was wise on the steep, uncertain terrain. I just wanted out of there, back to my car, back to civilization, and the comfort of rational explanations. I reached the trailhead just as the sun was setting. My rental car was there, exactly where I'd left it, but parked beside it was another car, the same make, same model, same color. Even the same rental company sticker in the rear window. I approached cautiously, peering through the windows. The interior looked identical to my rental, down to the GPS unit mounted on the dashboard and a half-empty water bottle in the cup holder. But when I checked the license plate, it was different, similar but not the same. I got into my own car quickly and drove away, checking the rear view mirror constantly. The other car didn't follow, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I spent that night in a Missoula motel, trying to process what had happened. I developed a film from the trip, hoping the photographs might provide some clue, some explanation for the bizarre encounters. What I found made my hands shake, so badly I could barely hold the contact sheets. Every photograph I'd taken had a duplicate, not similar shots, exact duplicates, taken from the identical position at the same moment. But there were subtle differences in each pair. In one version, a bird would be in flight. In the duplicate, the same bird would be perched on a branch. In one, clouds would cover a peak. In the duplicate, the sky would be clear. And in several of the shots that included reflections, the lake's surface, puddles after rain, I could see two figures where there should have been one. Two photographers in red and black jackets, standing in slightly different positions, as if the same person existed in two places simultaneously. I've been back in London for 6 weeks now, and I still don't know what to make of what happened in Lolo Forest. The rational explanations don't hold up under scrutiny. The irrational ones are too terrifying to contemplate. But the strangest thing is what's been happening since I returned. Little things, at first. Items appearing in my flat that I don't remember buying. Books I would choose, but hadn't purchased. Food in my refrigerator that I would eat, but don't recall shopping for. Photographs on my computer that I might have taken, but have no memory of shooting. And yesterday, something that made me start recording this account. I was reviewing client work on my computer when I found a folder I'd never created. It was labeled with yesterday's date and contained dozens of photographs of London. Street scenes, architectural details, portraits of strangers, all taken with my camera, all bearing my technical signature. The exposure settings, compositional choices, and aesthetic sensibilities that make my work recognizable. But I had no memory of taking any of them. I've checked my camera's memory card. The images are there, filed sequentially with the shots I do remember taking. According to the metadata, they were captured while I was supposedly working in my studio, editing other projects. But that's impossible. I was in my studio all day yesterday, alone, working on a commission that required my complete attention. I never left the building, never touched my camera, except to download earlier work. Yet somehow, somewhere, someone who uses my equipment and sees the world exactly as I do was out on the streets of London, creating a photographic record of a day I spent indoors. The duplicate lens cap is still in my desk drawer. I've examined it dozens of times, looking for some sign that it's not real, not genuine, but it's identical to its counterpart in every way that matters. Same material, same manufacturing marks, same wear patterns. The only difference is that initials inside. JM, written in my handwriting but not by my hand. I've been thinking about going back to Montana, not to Lolo Forest. I don't think I could face that again, but somewhere nearby, maybe with proper equipment this time. Cameras set up to record continuously, motion sensors, whatever it takes to document what's happening. But I'm afraid of what I might find. Or more accurately, I'm afraid of what might find me. You see, I've started to suspect that what happened in Lolo Forest was an encounter with someone else. I think I met another version of myself, a parallel existence, a duplicate life running alongside my own. And somehow, during those few days in the wilderness, the boundaries between our separate realities became permeable. Now I can't tell which experiences are mine and which belong to the other James Morrison, which photographs I've taken and which he's taken, which life I'm living and which one I'm watching from the outside. Sometimes, late at night, I catch my reflection doing things I don't remember doing, moving slightly out of sync with my own actions, as if there's a delay between intention and reflection. And in those moments, I wonder if I'm the original James Morrison, or if I'm the duplicate who somehow ended up in the wrong reality. The rain starting now, drumming against my studio windows the same way it drummed against my tent that night beside the Alpine Lake. And in the reflection in the dark glass, I can see someone else's studio, someone else's equipment, someone else's work, all identical to mine, but subtly wrong. Like looking at a photograph and it's negative at the same time. I think the other James Morrison is still out there, still taking photographs, still living a life that mirrors mine in every detail. And sometimes, in the space between realities, our paths cross again. The question that keeps me awake at night is this: if there are two of us, which one is real? And which one is just a reflection that learned to exist on its own? I'm going to tell you something that will sound completely mad, and I wouldn't blame you for thinking I've lost my mind entirely. But I need to get this out. Need someone else to know what happened to me in Lolo National Forest. Because if I don't tell this story, if I keep it locked inside my head much longer, I think I really will go insane. Have you ever had a day that felt like it would never end? Not in the metaphorical sense. We all have those tedious work days or sleepless nights that seem to drag on forever. I mean, literally never end. The same 24 hours repeating over and over, like a broken record that keeps skipping back to beginning. That's what happened to me. I lived the same day in Lolo Forest 47 times. The exact same day, from sunrise to sunrise, with every detail repeating in perfect, maddening precision. And by the time I finally escaped, if escape is even the right word, I'd learned things about that forest, about reality itself, that I wish I could forget. I was meant to be there for just one night. A quick camping trip during a business journey across the states. Something to break up the monotony of airports and hotel rooms. I work in software development, spending most of my time staring at screens full of code, so any chance to get outdoors feels like a gift. I'd driven up from Bozeman on a Thursday evening in early October, following winding mountain roads that led deeper and deeper into wilderness. The forecast called for clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect weather for a solo camping trip. I'd chosen Lolo specifically because it was vast and relatively undeveloped, the sort of place where you could still find genuine solitude. The campground I'd selected was primitive. No facilities, no other campers, just a small clearing beside a creek about 12 miles from the nearest road. I'd reserved it online, though reserved was a generous term for what amounted to marking my name on a basic Forest Service form. I arrived just as the sun was setting, that golden hour when the forest takes on almost magical quality. Shafts of light slanted to the towering pines, illuminating patches of forest floor carpeted with fallen needles. The air smelled of resin and wood smoke from distant wildfires, mixed with the crisp scent of approaching autumn. Setting up camp took maybe 30 minutes. I'd done it so many times that the routine was automatic. Stake out the tent site, assemble the poles, stake down the rain fly, organize my gear inside. Simple tasks that connected me to something more basic than the digital world I usually inhabited. I cooked a simple dinner on my camping stove, just pasta with tin sauce, nothing fancy, and ate while watching the last light fade from the western sky. The silence was profound, broken only by the gentle murmur of the creek and the occasional call of a night bird. Perfect. I remember checking my watch as I cleaned up after dinner. 8:30. The stars were just becoming visible through the canopy overhead, and I was looking forward to a few hours of stargazing before turning in early. I planned to wake at dawn, break camp, and be back on the road by mid-morning. That was the plan. Anyway, I went to sleep around 10 o'clock, lulled by the sound of running water and the whisper of wind in the trees. It had been a long day of driving, and I fell asleep almost immediately, the deep, restful sleep that only comes in wild places far from artificial light and electronic noise. I woke to my alarm at 6:30, just as I always do when camping. The sky was beginning to lighten, that gray, pre-dawn glow that promises sunrise. I unzipped my tent and looked out a morning that was absolutely perfect. Clear skies, calm air, the creek sparkling in the early light. I went through my usual morning routine. Quick wash in the creek, instant coffee on the camp stove, oatmeal with dried fruit for breakfast. I was feeling refreshed and energized, ready for the drive ahead. The weather was holding beautifully, and I was already planning my next camping trip. I broke camp efficiently, everything packed and loaded into my car by 8 o'clock. The drive out took about 20 minutes on the winding forest road, and I was just thinking about which route to take toward my next destination when something odd happened. I came around a bend in the road and saw something that shouldn't have been there. My own car, parked at the same trailhead where I'd started the hike to my campsite. Same make, same model, same rental company sticker, but I was driving my car. How could it be parked there as well? I pulled over and got out, walking toward the parked vehicle. The license plate was identical to mine. When I looked through the windows, I could see my camping gear in the back seat, the same gear that was currently in the car I'd just been driving. I turned around and looked at my own car, the one I just parked. It was gone. The road behind me was empty, as if I'd walked there instead of driving. My hands were shaking as I got into what I now had to assume was my car, though I had no memory of parking it there, and drove back toward the campsite. Maybe I was more tired than I'd thought. Maybe I'd gotten turned around, confused about which direction I'd been heading. But when I reached the clearing where I'd camped, my tent was there, fully set up, exactly as I'd left it the evening before. My camping stove sat on the picnic table. My food bag hung from the bare cable I'd rigged between two trees. I stood there staring at the campsite, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I distinctly remembered breaking camp that morning, packing everything into my car. But here it all was, as if I'd never left. I checked my watch. It read 6:30 a.m., the same time I'd woken up in my tent an hour earlier. That's when the real fear started to creep in. I looked around the campsite more carefully, noting details I remember from the night before. A pine cone I'd kicked away from my tent door. It was in exactly the same position. The arrangement of stones around my fire ring, which I'd carefully dismantled that morning, unchanged. Even the water level in my bottle, which I'd nearly emptied making coffee, completely full. I walked to the creek and splashed cold water on my face, trying to clear my head. Maybe I was having some kind of breakdown, some stress-induced hallucination, but the water felt real, the cold shock of it sharp and immediate. I spent the day trying to understand what was happening. I explored the area around my campsite, looking for clues, for anything that might explain the apparent reset. But everything was exactly as it had been the day before. Every fallen log, every arrangement of rocks, every pattern of light and shadow. As evening approached, I watched the sun set in precisely the same sequence I'd observed the night before. The same clouds, the same colors, the same moment when the last light disappeared behind the trees. I cooked the same dinner, ate it while sitting in the same spot, cleaned up using the same routine. I went to sleep hoping that morning would bring normality, that I'd wake up and everything would make sense again. I woke to my alarm at 6:30. The same gray pre-dawn light, the same weather, the same sounds from the forest around me. I checked my watch, checked my phone, checked every timepiece I had. All showed the same date, the same time I'd woken up the day before. Or was it the day before? How do you measure time when time itself seems to have stopped? I tried breaking the pattern. Instead of my usual routine, I stayed in my sleeping bag until noon. But when I finally got up and checked my watch, it still showed 6:30 a.m. The sun was in the wrong position for noon. The light had the quality of early morning rather than midday. I tried leaving immediately, hiking out to my car without breakfast or coffee. But when I reached the trailhead, the same thing happened. I found myself back at the campsite with no memory of the return journey. Looking at my watch as it showed 6:30 a.m., by the third repetition, I was beginning to understand the rules of whatever was happening to me. I was stuck in a loop, reliving the same day over and over. But unlike the film that explores this concept, I wasn't in some charming small town with quirky characters to interact with. I was alone in thousands of acres of wilderness, with nothing but my own thoughts for company. The isolation was the worst part. At least Bill Murray's character had other people around, even if they couldn't remember the previous loops. I had trees and rocks and a creek that followed the same patterns every single day. The same birds calling at the same times, the same squirrel chattering from the same branch, the same clouds forming and dissolving in identical sequences. I tried everything I could think of to break the cycle. I hiked in different directions, exploring parts of forest I'd never seen. I stayed awake all night, watching the stars follow their predetermined paths across the sky. I tried to injure myself, thinking pain might shock me out of whatever this was. Nothing worked. Every morning, I woke at 6:30 to the same gray light and the same maddening repetition. After the 10th loop, I started keeping detailed notes, documenting everything I observed. The exact time the sun appeared above the tree line, 7:43 a.m. The moment the wind picked up, 2:17 p.m. The sequence of bird calls that began each evening. First a jay at 6:52, then the owl starting at 8:33. I memorized the forest around my campsite with obsessive precision. Every tree, every rock formation, every variation in the creek's flow. I could navigate through the darkness with my eyes closed, could predict the weather patterns hours in advance, could tell you which leaves would fall from which branches at exactly what moment. But knowledge didn't bring understanding. I was no closer to escaping the loop after 20 repetitions than I had been after 2. The psychological toll was enormous. Have you ever tried to maintain your sanity when nothing you do has any lasting consequence? When every choice you make is erased at 6:30 a.m., reset back to the same starting point. I began to understand why solitary confinement is considered torture. The mind needs novelty, needs progression, needs a sense that time is moving forward. I went through phases. Anger first, raging at the forest, at whatever cosmic joke had trapped me there. Then bargaining, trying to figure out what I was supposed to learn, what lesson I needed to absorb before being released. Then depression, lying in my tent for days at a time, refusing to engage with the endless repetition. But eventually I reached a kind of acceptance. If I was going to be stuck here indefinitely, I might as well make the best of it. I started treating each loop as an opportunity to explore, to observe, to understand the forest in ways that would be impossible under normal circumstances. I learned things no human was ever meant to know. The secret life of the forest, the patterns that only become visible when you have unlimited time to observe them. I discovered that trees communicate through underground networks, sending chemical signals that coordinate their responses to threats. I watched the same family of deer follow identical routes through the underbrush, generation after generation, playing out the same survival strategies. I found places in the forest that seemed to exist outside normal space, clearings that were larger on the inside than their boundaries suggested, rock formations that cast shadows in impossible directions. And I began to understand that Lolo Forest was more than just a collection of trees and wildlife. It was a kind of organism itself, with its own intelligence, its own purposes. That's when I realized why I was trapped. You see, the forest had been trying to tell me something. All those repetitions, all that enforced observation. It was a form of communication, a way of sharing knowledge that couldn't be conveyed through normal human senses. The forest was ancient, had been watching and learning for centuries, and it had chosen me as a receptor for information it needed to preserve. But I had been fighting the process, resisting the download of knowledge that the forest was trying to give me. My human mind, accustomed to linear time and individual consciousness, couldn't accept the vast, cyclical intelligence that surrounded me. It was on the 47th loop that I finally stopped fighting and let the forest Indiana. I can't describe what that felt like in terms you'd understand. Imagine suddenly being able to perceive not just the present moment, but all the moments that had ever occurred in that place. Every season, every year, every decade layered on top of each other like transparent films. I could see the forest as it had been before humans arrived, could witness the cycles of growth and death and renewal that had played out for millennia. I'm not sure how to explain what happened to me in Lolo National Forest without sounding completely barmy, but I need to tell someone, And perhaps you'll understand why I can never go camping alone again. Why certain sounds, ordinary everyday sounds, now make me break into a cold sweat and search frantically for the nearest exit. It started with a humming. You know the sort, absent-minded, tuneless humming that people do when they're concentrating on something else. The kind your grandmother might make while knitting, or a workman might produce while fixing a fence. Perfectly normal, perfectly innocent, until it's not. I was researching a book at the time, a historical piece about the early settlers in Montana, dry academic work that required long stretches of solitude to properly focus on the writing. I'd rented a cottage in the Scottish Highlands a year before for similar work, and it had been so productive that I decided to try the same approach in America. Lolo National Forest seemed perfect, vast, remote, with established camping areas that offered solitude without complete isolation. I could drive in, set up for a week or two, and immerse myself completely in the work without the distractions of modern life. I'm Sarah, by the way. Sarah Chun. I teach history at Cambridge when I'm not wandering off to write books in remote places. 43 years old, sensible, not given flights of fancy or supernatural nonsense. I mention this because what I'm about to tell you goes against everything I believed about the rational, ordered world I thought I lived in. I drove up from Helena on a Tuesday in mid-November, late in the season for camping, but I checked the weather forecast religiously. A high-pressure system was settling over the region, promising clear skies and mild temperatures for at least 10 days. Perfect for someone who needed to work without interruption. The campsite I'd chosen was well off the main roads, accessible only by a forestry track that wound through dense stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. The Forest Service description mentioned a small clearing beside a seasonal stream, with space for one tent and a fire ring. No facilities, no other campers likely at that time of year. Exactly what I needed. I arrived just as the afternoon light was beginning to slant low through the trees. November light has a different quality from summer sunshine, thinner, more golden, with that underlying hint that winter is coming whether you're ready or not. I camped in autumn before and loved the crisp clarity of it, the way it sharpened your senses and made you appreciate every moment of warmth. Setting up camp took about an hour. I had good gear, a 4-season tent that could handle whatever weather Montana might throw at me, a sleeping system rated for well below freezing, a camp stove that would work reliably even in wind and snow. I'd learned from experience that comfort and safety in remote places depend entirely on proper equipment. By the time I had everything organized, darkness was falling. I cooked a simple dinner and ate by the light of my headlamp, reviewing my research notes and planning the next day's writing. The silence was profound, that particular quality of quiet you only find in deep forest, where the nearest road is miles away and the night sounds are all natural. That's when I first heard it, just faint at first, so quiet I almost missed it beneath the whisper of wind in the trees. Someone humming a tune I didn't recognize. Not particularly melodic, more like the absent-minded vocalization people make when they're working with their hands. I switched off my headlamp and listened carefully. The humming continued, seeming to come from somewhere deeper in the forest. It wasn't threatening. Quite the opposite, actually. There was something comforting about it. Domestic almost, like having a neighbor puttering about in their garden while you worked in yours. I called out into the darkness. "Hello? Is someone there?" The humming stopped immediately. I waited, listening to the night sounds of the forest, but heard nothing more. After a few minutes, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. The mind plays tricks when you're alone in wild places, especially after long hours of concentrated mental work. I finished my dinner and retreated to my tent, where I spent another hour working on my laptop by the light of a small camping lantern. The battery would last for days, and the computer gave me several hours of work time. before needing to be recharged from my power bank. Perfect for the kind of sustained writing I needed to do. I fell asleep easily, lulled by the profound quiet and the comfortable sense of being completely alone in thousands of acres of wilderness. I woke around 3 in the morning to the sound of humming, much closer this time. So close it seemed to be coming from just outside my tent. The same tuneless, absent-minded humming I'd heard earlier, but now accompanied by other sounds. Soft footsteps on forest floor, the occasional scrape of metal on stone, the quiet thump of something being set down carefully. Someone was working just meters from where I lay, moving around my campsite with the casual familiarity of someone going about routine tasks. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The footsteps moved in a regular pattern around my tent, not circling exactly, but following some kind of purposeful route. Whatever they were doing, they were being careful not to disturb me. The sounds were muffled, considerate, like someone trying not to wake a sleeping household. After maybe 20 minutes, the sounds faded away. The humming grew distant, then disappeared entirely. I waited another hour before working up the courage to unzip my tent and look outside. The campsite looked exactly as I'd left it. No footprints in the soft earth, no disturbed vegetation, no sign that anyone had been there. Even the area immediately around my tent, where I was certain I'd heard someone working, showed no trace of disturbance. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening to every sound the forest made. But apart from a normal night's sounds, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, everything was quiet. Morning came clear and cold, with frost coating my tent and turning my breath to visible puffs in the crisp air. I made coffee and tried to convince myself that the humming had been a dream, a product of unfamiliar surroundings and the heightened awareness that comes with sleeping alone in wild places. I spent the day writing, settling into the productive rhythm I'd hoped to achieve. The work flowed well in the forest silence, my concentration deeper and more sustained than ever was in civilization. By evening, I'd made more progress than I typically manage in a full week at home. As darkness fell, I prepared dinner and lit my camping lantern, looking forward to another productive evening of work. The temperature was dropping, and I could see my breath in the lamplight, but my tent was warm and comfortable. That's when the humming started again. Same tuneless melody, same absent-minded quality. But this time, it began while I was still awake and alert. I could track its approach through the forest, growing gradually louder as whatever was making it move toward my campsite. I switched off my lantern and sat in darkness, listening. The humming circled my camp at what seemed like a consistent distance, maybe 30 or 40 yards out in the trees. It never came closer, never moved away, just maintained that steady orbit while the unknown person continued their quiet work. Because it was definitely work. I could hear tools being used, the scrape of metal on wood, the soft thud of something being hammered, the whisper of sawdust falling to the ground. Someone was building something out there in the darkness, working by feel, or perhaps with a light too dim for me to see. This continued for several hours. The humming would stop occasionally, replaced by more concentrated work sounds, then resume as the person moved to a new location, always maintaining that same distance from my camp, always careful not to come too close. Around midnight, everything went quiet again. I waited until I was certain whoever was gone, then crept out of my tent with my torch to investigate. I followed the direction where the sounds had been loudest, pushing through undergrowth and around tree trunks, looking for any sign of what I'd heard. But once again, there was nothing. No footprints, no wood shavings, no evidence of construction or disturbance, except for one thing. At the base of a large Douglas fir, maybe 40 yards from my tent, I found a small pile of pine cones arranged in a neat pyramid. They were fresh cones, recently fallen, arranged with the kind of precision that only comes from human hands. Someone had been there, had taken the time to create this small, purposeful arrangement. I stared at the pine cone pyramid for a long time, trying to understand what it meant. It wasn't threatening, quite the opposite. There was something almost welcoming about it, like a small gift left by a shy neighbor. I returned to my tent and spent another sleepless night listening to the forest. But everything remained quiet until dawn. The pattern continued for the next 4 nights. Each evening, as darkness fell, the humming would begin. The invisible worker would circle my campsite, always maintaining that same respectful distance, going about their mysterious construction projects while I listened from inside my tent. And each morning, I would find new evidence of their presence. Another pile of pine cones, arranged in a different geometric pattern. Smooth stones stacked in careful cairns. Small twigs woven together into intricate, basket-like structures and hung from low branches. None of it was threatening. If anything, the creations were beautiful in their simplicity, like finding folk art scattered through the forest. But the inability to see who was making them, the complete absence of any human trace except these small gifts, was deeply unsettling. On the 6th night, something changed. The humming began as usual, but this time it was accompanied by a different sound. Singing, not words exactly, but vocalization that had the rise and fall of melody, the rhythm of language, a woman's voice, clear and sweet, singing something that sounded almost like a lullaby. I found myself relaxing as I listened, the anxiety I'd been carrying for days melting away. There was something deeply comforting about the voice, maternal almost, like being sung to sleep by someone who cared about your well-being. Without quite realizing what I was doing, I began to hum along, just quietly under my breath, following the melody as it wove through variations I couldn't predict but somehow knew. It felt natural, like remembering a song from childhood that you've forgotten you ever knew. The singing grew stronger, more confident, as if encouraged by my participation. And gradually, I became aware that there were other voices joining in, not just the original singer, but a whole chorus of voices harmonizing in the darkness around my campsite. Men and women, old and young, all singing the same wordless melody that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious memory. The sound surrounded me completely, rising from every direction, creating a sphere of music with my tent at its center. I should have been terrified. I was alone in the wilderness, surrounded by an invisible choir of unknown singers. But the music was so beautiful, so filled with warmth and welcome, that fear seemed impossible. I felt safer than I had in years, protected and cherished by whatever presence had been watching over my campsite. The singing continued for hours, sometimes fading to a whisper, sometimes swelling to fill the entire forest with harmony. I found myself drifting in and out of peaceful half-sleep, lulled by voices that seemed to know exactly what I needed to hear. When I woke the next morning, the first thing I noticed was the silence, not the normal forest quiet I'd grown accustomed to, but complete absence of sound that felt almost unnatural. No bird singing, no wind in the trees, no rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I dressed quickly and emerged from my tent to find my campsite transformed. Overnight, someone or several someones had been busy. The area around my tent was decorated with dozens of small creations. Pine cone sculptures, twig arrangements, cairns of smooth stones, patterns of leaves and flowers that turned the clearing into a work of art. But it was more than decoration. As I looked more carefully, I realized that every piece had been placed with purpose. The stone cairns marked the cardinal directions. The twig sculptures created sight lines toward specific trees or landmarks. The entire arrangement formed a kind of map, a guide to something hidden in the forest around me. I followed the obvious path, the line of markers that led from my campsite deeper into the trees. The trail was subtle but unmistakable once you knew to look for it. A small arrow of arranged twigs here, a pile of stones pointing the way there. The path led uphill through increasingly dense forest, winding between massive tree trunks and around granite outcroppings that thrust up from the forest floor like ancient monuments. I'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when I heard it again, the humming. But this time, I could see where it was coming from. There was a woman standing in a small clearing ahead of me, her back turned as she worked at something I couldn't quite make out. She was humming that same tuneless melody I'd been hearing for days, completely absorbed in whatever task occupied her attention. She was dressed in clothes that seemed slightly out of time, simple, practical garments that looked handmade rather than store-bought. Her hair was long and gray, braided with small flowers and twigs that gave her an almost ethereal appearance. I approached slowly, not wanting to startle her, but as I got closer, something about her seemed wrong. She was too still, too focused, working with movements that were precise but somehow mechanical. "Hello," I called out softly. She didn't respond, didn't even seem to hear me. The humming continued, and her hands kept moving in whatever task she was performing. I moved around to see what she was working on and felt my blood turn to ice. She was building something from human bones, not a complete skeleton. Scattered bones arranged in patterns that seemed to have meaning but no obvious purpose. Femurs and ribs laid out in geometric designs. Smaller bones sorted by size and type. All arranged with the same careful precision I'd seen in the pine cone sculptures back of my campsite. I stumbled backward, finally understanding what I'd been listening to for the past week. This wasn't a living person going about innocent tasks in the forest. This was something else, something that had been creating its art from materials I didn't want to think about. The woman, if she was a woman, never stopped humming, never acknowledged my presence. Her hands continued their methodical work, arranging and rearranging bones with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. I backed away as quietly as I could, then turned and ran. I made it back to my campsite in record time, my heart hammering and my breath coming in ragged gasps. Without stopping to think, I began breaking camp, stuffing gear into my backpack with no regard for organization or care. I just wanted out of there, away from whatever I'd stumbled into. The hike back to my car took 2 hours that felt like 10. Every sound in the forest made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. The humming had stopped, but somehow that was worse than hearing it. At least when I could hear it, I knew where it was. I threw my gear into the car and drove straight back to Helena, not stopping until I was surrounded by electric lights and traffic noise and all the comfortable sounds of civilization. That was 3 months ago, and I still can't get that humming out of my head. It follows me everywhere now. Not constantly, but at the most unexpected moments. I'll be teaching a lecture and suddenly hear it underneath the normal classroom sounds. I'll be shopping for groceries and catch that tuneless melody drifting from the next aisle. I'll be falling asleep and hear it starting up in the distance, always just far enough away to be unsettling. I've tried to research what I might have encountered in Lolo Forest, local legends, historical records, anything that might explain what I saw. There are stories, scattered references to disappearances over the years, to hikers who went into the forest and never came out, but nothing that explains a woman with the bones, or the invisible chorus that surrounded my campsite. Sometimes I wonder if I imagine it all. Stress-induced hallucinations brought on by isolation and too much solitary work. But then I remember the bone arrangements, the systematic precision of what she was building, and I know it was real. The worst part is the doubt it's created about everything else. If something like that can exist so close to our normal world, hidden just beyond the reach of everyday experience, what else is out there? What other invisible presences share our spaces? going about their incomprehensible tasks while we remain blissfully unaware. I've stopped camping alone. I've stopped going anywhere alone if I can help it, because now I know that the humming isn't just a memory from Lolo Forest. It's a call, an invitation to return and take my place in whatever ceremony or construction project I interrupted. And the terrifying thing is, part of me wants to go back. Late at night, when the humming is strongest, I find myself remembering how peaceful it felt to be surrounded by those singing voices. How safe and protected I felt in that circle of invisible watchers. There was something deeply comforting about being chosen, about being welcomed into something ancient and purposeful. But then I remember the bones, and I know I can never go back. The humming is getting stronger, though more insistent. And sometimes when I'm very tired or distracted, I catch myself humming along with it again, just quietly under my breath, following a melody that seems to know exactly where it wants to lead me. Back to the forest, back to the clearing where the woman works with infinite patience, building something from pieces of people who thought they were just going camping. I don't know how much longer I can resist the call. The humming is in my dreams now, weaving through my thoughts during the day, becoming part of the soundtrack of my daily life. If you're listening to this, if I've managed to get this recording to someone before it's too late, please remember what I've told you. Stay away from Lolo National Forest. Don't camp alone in remote places. And if you ever hear humming in the wilderness, tuneless, absent-minded humming that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, don't follow it. Don't try to find the source. And whatever you do, don't hum along. Because once you join the song, you become part of whatever they're building out there in the darkness. And I don't think anyone ever gets to leave. The humming is starting again now, right outside my flat, drifting up from the street below. But when I look out the window, there's no one there. Just a sound, patient and persistent, waiting for me to come down and follow it home. I'm going to tell you about hunger. Not the ordinary kind, missing a meal, feeling peckish before dinner, but something far more insidious. A hunger that starts small and grows until it consumes everything you are, everything you think you know about yourself. A hunger I brought back from Lolo National Forest, and one that I fear will never truly leave me. My name is Marcus Webb, and I used to be a food critic for The Guardian. Used to be, because after what happened to me in Montana, I can't bear to be around food anymore. Can't stand the smell of cooking. Can't tolerate restaurants. Can barely manage to eat enough to stay alive. The irony isn't lost on me. A man who built a career around the pleasure of eating, now terrified of his own appetite. It started as a survival challenge. You know the sort. Modern person attempt to live off the land for a week, rediscovering primitive skills our ancestors took for granted. I'd pitched it to my editor as a way to understand food at its most basic level, to explore the relationship between hunger and satisfaction that's been lost in our world of abundant convenience. Lolo National Forest seemed perfect for the experiment. Vast wilderness with abundant wildlife, edible plants, clean water sources. Remote enough that I'd be forced to rely entirely on my own skills, but not so isolated that a rescue would be impossible if things went wrong. I'd done my research, of course, spent months preparing, learning about edible plants native to Montana, studying primitive hunting and fishing techniques, practicing firemaking and shelter construction. I'd even done a weekend course with a survival instructor in Wales, living on nettle soup and foraged berries, until I thought I understood what real hunger felt like. I was wrong about that. Completely, utterly wrong. I drove up to the forest in early September, when the weather was still mild but the summer crowds had thinned out. I'd chosen a remote area near the Idaho border, accessible only by logging roads that hadn't seen maintenance in years. The sort of place where you could go days without seeing another human being. The plan was simple. 1 week with nothing but the clothes on my back. a basic knife, and a small metal pot for boiling water. No food, no fishing gear, no modern conveniences. Just me and whatever the forest could provide. The first day was almost enjoyable. I set up a basic shelter using fallen branches and pine boughs, gathered dry wood for a fire, located a reliable water source. The forest was beautiful in early autumn. Golden aspen leaves scattered among the evergreens, crisp air that carried the scent of pine and wood smoke from distant wildfires. I found what I thought were edible mushrooms and made a thin soup with water and some wild onions I'd identified correctly. It wasn't much, but combined with a handful of pine nuts and some service berries, it felt like enough. My stomach complained a bit, but nothing I couldn't handle. By the third day, real hunger was setting in. The handful of calories I was managing to forage each day wasn't nearly enough to sustain my body weight. I'd lost maybe 5 pounds already, and my energy levels were dropping noticeably. But this was expected, part of the challenge I'd set for myself. I tried to catch fish in the creek near my camp, fashioning hooks from bent wire and using insects as bait. But either my technique was poor or the fish weren't interested, because I caught nothing. I attempted to trap small game using deadfall snares I read about, but came up empty there as well. The fourth day was when things began to change. I woke that morning with a gnawing emptiness in my stomach that seemed to have developed its own personality overnight. Not just physical hunger, but something more intense, more focused. I found myself obsessing over food in ways that went beyond normal appetite. I spent hours staring at a squirrel that had made the mistake of foraging near my camp, imagining exactly how I would kill it, skin it, cook it over my small fire. I could practically taste the meat, could picture fat crackling as it roasted. The fantasy was so vivid it made me salivate uncontrollably. But when I finally worked up the courage to try catching the squirrel with my bare hands, it easily outmaneuvered me and disappeared into the canopy. I was left crouched among the pine needles, shaking with frustration, and something that felt dangerously close to rage. That's when I found the deer. It was lying maybe 50 yards from my camp, partially hidden by fallen logs. A young doe, recently dead but still warm. No obvious wounds, no sign of what had killed it. Just fresh meat, more than I could eat in a week, lying there as a place specifically for my benefit. Any rational person would have been suspicious. Wild animals don't just die conveniently near starving humans without cause. But rational thought was rapidly becoming secondary to the hunger that was now controlling most of my mental processes. I butchered the deer with my knife, working with an efficiency that surprised me. I'd never dressed a large animal before, but somehow my hands knew exactly what to do. How to separate the hide from meat, how to identify the best cuts, how to avoid puncturing organs that would spoil the flesh. The first bite of roasted venison was transcendent, not just because I was starving, but because the meat itself seemed to possess flavors I'd never experienced before. Rich, complex, with undertones that shifted and developed as I chewed. I ate until my shrunken stomach couldn't hold any more, then sat by the fire in a state of almost euphoric satisfaction. I should have been grateful. Instead, I found myself calculating how long the meat would last, how I could preserve it, whether there might be more deer in the area. The thought of returning to foraging for berries and nuts after tasting something so perfect seemed unbearable. That night, I dreamed of meat, not the civilized cut you'd find in a butcher shop, but something wilder, more primal. In the dream, I was hunting through the forest with my bare hands, tracking prey by scent alone, feeling the pulse of living things beneath my fingers. I woke with the taste of blood in my mouth. The fifth day brought fresh kills. Another deer, this one larger than the first. Then a young elk, its throat torn out by what must have been a large predator. Each discovery was perfectly timed to my needs, appearing just as I was finishing the previous animal. I began to develop theories. about what was happening. Perhaps there was a pack of wolves in the area, bringing down game and abandoning the kills. Perhaps some disease was affecting the local wildlife, causing animals to weaken and die naturally. I didn't really believe these explanations, but they allowed me to continue eating without examining the situation too closely, because the meat was changing me, not just physically, though I was growing stronger despite the week of supposed starvation, but mentally as well. My senses were becoming sharper, more acute. I could smell animals from hundreds of yards away, could hear the heartbeat of a mouse hiding in the undergrowth, could track movement to the forest even in complete darkness. And the hunger was growing stronger. No matter how much I ate, it was never enough. Each meal only seemed to awaken a deeper craving, a need that went beyond simple nutrition. On the 6th day, I caught my reflection in the creek and barely recognized what I saw. My face had become leaner, more angular, with shadows under my cheekbones that hadn't been there before. But it was my eyes that truly unsettled me. They were brighter than they should have been, with a predatory intensity that reminded me of the big cats I'd seen in nature documentaries. And when I smiled, experimenting with different expressions, my teeth looked sharper. Not dramatically so, but enough to notice. Enough to make me run my tongue over incisors that seemed designed for tearing flesh rather than the omnivorous diet humans were meant to eat. I tried to convince myself it was the lighting, the distortion of water, the effects of rapid weight loss. But deep down, I knew something fundamental was changing in my body's relationship with food, with hunger, with the act of consuming other living things. The 7th day, my last planned day in the forest, I woke to find something different waiting for me. Not another conveniently dead animal, but something alive. A rabbit, caught in what appeared to be a primitive snare, but still breathing, still warm, still looking at me with dark eyes that seemed to hold an intelligence I'd never noticed in prey animals before. I knew I should release it. The rabbit was clearly someone else's catch, not mine to take. But the hunger was so strong now that rational thought felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. The smell of the living animal, the sound of its rapid heartbeat, the way its pulse was visible beneath the fur of its throat. All of it triggered cravings that overrode every civilized instinct I possessed. I killed the rabbit with my bare hands. Not quickly, not cleanly, but with a slow deliberation that let me savor every moment of his life ebbing away. And as I felt its heart stop beating beneath my fingers, I experienced something that should have horrified me, but instead filled me with a satisfaction deeper than any meal I'd ever consumed. I ate the rabbit raw, not because I couldn't be bothered to build a fire, but because the cooked meat no longer satisfied the hunger the way fresh blood did. The warm flesh, the metallic taste of its life, still clinging to the tissue, that was what my body craved now. What I craved. I hiked out that afternoon as planned, but I was no longer the same person who had entered the forest a week earlier. The hunger came with me, nested deep in my chest like a living thing with its own needs and desires. That was 4 months ago, and the hunger has only grown stronger. I've tried to return to normal eating, try to go back to my old life of restaurant reviews and gourmet meals. But nothing tastes right anymore. Cooked food seems flat lifeless, like chewing on cardboard. Even the finest cuisine London has to offer feels like a poor substitute for what I really want. What I need. I've started frequenting butcher shops, buying the freshest cuts I can find and eating them barely seared, still bloody in the center. The butchers think I'm just another foodie with eccentric tastes, but I can see the concern in their eyes when I ask for meat that's been hung for the shortest possible time. I've lost weight despite eating constantly. My body seems to be changing, becoming leaner and more efficient, as if optimizing itself for a different kind of existence. I catch myself moving differently too, more quietly, with a fluid grace that feels foreign but somehow natural. and the dreams have become more vivid. Almost every night now, I'm hunting through forests that feel more real than my waking life. The scent of prey is so intense I wake up salivating. The phantom taste of blood, so strong I have to check my mouth for cuts. Last week, I caught myself following a woman down a dark street, staying exactly far enough behind to avoid detection, while studying the way she moved, the rhythm of her breathing, the vulnerability of the space between her shoulder blades. It was only when she turned into a well-lit shop that I realized what I was doing and forced myself to turn around and go home. But the hunger followed me. It always follows me now. I've been researching what happened to me in Lolo Forest, trying to understand the mechanism behind my transformation. There are stories, scattered references in folklore and anthropological texts about places where the boundaries between human and animal consciousness become permeable. Locations where prolonged exposure to primal conditions can awaken appetites that civilization has taught us to suppress. But the academic explanations don't capture the reality of living with this hunger, the way it whispers to me during quiet moments, painting detailed fantasies of the hunt, of the kill, of the exquisite moment when life becomes food, the way it's slowly eroding my human identity, replacing civilized thought with predatory instinct. I've tried fasting, thinking that if I could starve the hunger it might weaken and eventually disappear. But after 3 days without food, I found myself standing outside a primary school at closing time, watching the children stream out and calculating which ones were isolated enough, small enough, vulnerable enough. That's when I knew I was becoming something that couldn't be allowed to exist around other people. I'm planning to go back to Lolo Forest, not for another survival challenge, but because I think the forest is the only place where what I'm becoming might belong, where the hunger can be fed without violating every moral principle I once held sacred. I'm recording this as a warning, but also as a confession. If you ever find yourself in a situation like mine, isolated, starving, presented with opportunities that seem too convenient to be natural, think carefully before you take that first bite, because some hungers, once awakened, can never be satisfied, and some transformations can never be reversed. The meat in my refrigerator is calling to me now. 3 pounds of the finest beef I could find, aged perfectly, still carrying the scent of the animal it used to be. But it won't be enough. It's never enough anymore. Soon, I'll need something fresher. Something that fought back. Something that had hopes and dreams and a beating heart right up until the moment I took its life. The forest taught me that everything is food if you're hungry enough. And I'm always hungry now. Always hunting. Always waiting for the moment when civilization's thin veneer finally cracks completely, and I become what the hunger has been shaping me into all along. If you're listening to this, if you've made it this far, do me one favor. Stay away from remote places when you're hungry. Stay away from convenient opportunities. Stay away from meat that tastes too good to be natural, because the hunger is patient, and once it finds you, it never lets you go. I can hear my neighbors moving around upstairs. A young couple, always laughing, always full of life. The scent of their vitality drifts down to the floorboards, mixing with the aroma of the raw meat waiting in my kitchen. The hunger is growing stronger by the minute. I think it's time to go back to the forest, before I do something that can't be undone, before I become something that hunts in places where people are supposed to be safe. I need to tell you about the children I found in Lolo National Forest. Not because I want to relive what happened. God knows I try to forget. But because someone needs to know the truth about that place. Someone needs to understand why I can never sleep properly anymore. Why the sound of children playing makes me break into a cold sweat. Why I moved 3 times trying to get away from playgrounds and schools. My name is Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, and I'm a child psychologist. Or rather, It's difficult to continue treating children when you can no longer trust your own perception of what childhood should look like, when every laugh feels like it might be hiding something terrible. I went to Montana last autumn for what was supposed to be a restorative camping trip. I'd been working with severely traumatized children for nearly 15 years. Abuse cases, neglect, kids who'd seen things no human being should have to witness. The work was necessary, vital even, but it had been grinding me down year by year until I barely recognized myself anymore. My supervisor had been pushing me to take extended leave, warning about burnout and secondary trauma. She was right, of course. I was having nightmares about my cases, seeing signs of abuse in every child I encountered, becoming hyper-vigilant to the point where normal parent-child interactions looked suspicious to me. So I booked 2 weeks in Montana, planning to hike and camp and remember what it felt like to exist without constantly analyzing every human interaction for signs of damage. Lolo National Forest seemed perfect, vast, remote, the sort of place where you could walk for days without seeing another soul. I flew into Missoula on a Friday evening in late October. The trees were spectacular, golden aspens and red maples scattered among the evergreens like nature's own stained glass windows. I spent the weekend in town buying last-minute supplies and studying trail maps, then drove out to one of the more remote trailheads on Monday morning. The forecast was favorable. Clear skies, mild temperatures, no precipitation expected for at least a week. Perfect conditions for someone who needed to spend time alone with her thoughts, to process months of accumulated stress in the healing silence of wilderness. The trail I'd chosen led to a series of alpine lakes about 20 miles into the backcountry. It was rated as moderate difficulty, well within my capabilities, and remote enough that I was unlikely to encounter other hikers, the sort of solitude I desperately needed. I set off just after sunrise, my pack loaded with everything I'd need for a week of solo camping. Good gear, carefully chosen food, first aid supplies, and emergency communication equipment. I'd been hiking for years and knew the importance of preparation, especially when traveling alone. The first day's walk was exactly what I'd hoped for. The trail wound through dense forest punctuated by meadows that offered stunning views of distant peaks. I saw deer, heard the calls of unfamiliar birds, breathed air so clean it made my lungs ache after months of London pollution. I made camp that evening beside a small creek, maybe 12 miles from the trailhead, set up my tent on level ground, cooked a simple meal, then sat watching the stars appear as darkness fell. For the first time in months, I felt my shoulders relax, felt the constant tension I'd been carrying begin to ease. I slept deeply that night, lulled by the sound of running water and the profound quiet that only exists in true wilderness. When I woke at dawn, I felt more rested than I had in years. The second day took me higher into mountains, following a fainter trail that switched back up steep slopes covered in old-growth forest. The trees were magnificent, some of them clearly centuries old, their trunks so massive I couldn't have wrapped my arms around them. That's where I first heard the children. It was around midday, and I'd stopped for lunch in a small clearing that offered views back down the valley I climbed. I was eating my sandwich and reviewing the afternoon's route when I heard it. The distant sound of children playing. Laughter, shouts, the sort of joyful noise kids make when they're completely absorbed in some game. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the forest, maybe half a mile away through the trees. My first thought was confusion. I was miles from any road, in terrain too challenging for a family outing. But the sounds were unmistakable. Definitely children, definitely at play. Perhaps there was a youth group camping in the area, or a family with older kids who were more capable hikers than I'd assumed. I packed up my lunch and continued climbing, following the trail toward where I thought the sounds had originated. But as I gained elevation, the voices seemed to move as well, staying always just beyond my sight, but close enough to hear clearly. By late afternoon, I'd reached the first of the alpine lakes I'd been aiming for. It was beautiful, a pristine body of water surrounded by granite peaks, with small islands dotted across its surface. The perfect place to set up camp for several days. But as I scouted for a campsite, I heard the children again, much closer this time. So close it seemed they must be just around the next bend of the shoreline. I could make out individual voices now. A girl laughing, a boy calling out what sounded like instruction for a game, several others joining in with enthusiastic shouts. I followed the sound along the lake's edge, expecting to encounter other campers at any moment. But when I rounded the point where the voices seemed strongest, there was no one there, just empty shoreline, pristine and undisturbed. The voices had stopped as well. The sudden silence was almost eerie after the animated sounds of play I'd been tracking. I made camp near where I'd heard the children, thinking they might return. Perhaps they were day hikers who'd already started back down the mountain. The acoustics around the lake were unusual. Sound seemed to carry an echo in unexpected ways. As evening fell, I cooked dinner and tried to shake off the strange feeling that had been growing throughout the day. Something about the children's voices had bothered me, though I couldn't put my finger on what exactly. That's when my professional training kicked in, and I realized what had been nagging at me. The quality of the play's sounds I'd been hearing was wrong. Too perfect, too consistently joyful. In my years of working with children, I'd learned that real play includes moments of frustration, disagreement, tears alongside the laughter. But these voices have been relentlessly happy, without any of the natural variations that characterize genuine childhood interaction. I was pondering this when I heard them again. This time, they were much closer. So close I could make out not just individual voices, but actual words. Children calling each other by name, organizing some elaborate game that seemed to involve running, and hiding among the trees near my campsite. Jenny, over here. Tommy, you're at... Sarah, don't go too far. Normal playground chatter. But there was something artificial about it. Like listen to child actors performing rather than genuine spontaneous play. I grabbed my torch and walked toward the voices, calling out a friendly greeting. It's not unusual for children to be shy around strangers, but I wanted to let them know I was harmless. Perhaps find out where their parents were camped. Hello. I called into the darkness beyond my campfire's glow. I'm Dr. Hartwell. Are your mom and dad nearby? The voices stopped immediately. Complete silence fell over the forest, so sudden and absolute it made my ears ring. I waited several minutes, listening carefully, but heard nothing more. Eventually, I returned to my fire and tried to convince myself that the children had simply been frightened by an unexpected adult voice and had run back to their parents. But something about the encounter felt wrong. The way the voices had cut off so abruptly, the complete absence of any adult supervision in such remote terrain, the artificial quality of the play's sounds themselves. I barely slept that night. Every time I began to drift off, I'd hear whispers outside my tent. Not the children's voices this time, but something quieter, more secretive. Hushed conversations that seemed to be discussing me, though I could never quite make out the words. The third morning brought a discovery that made my blood run cold. As I was breaking camp, I found footprints in the soft earth around my tent. Small footprints, the size a child might make. But there were too many of them, arranged in patterns that suggested the children had been circling my campsite for hours, watching me sleep. And there was something wrong with the prints themselves. They were too deep for the apparent size, as if made by something much heavier than they appeared. And the spacing was odd, sometimes clustering together as if several children had been standing in the same spot, sometimes stretched out in distances too wide for a normal human gait. I followed the trail prints as far as I could, but they led into dense undergrowth where the forest floor showed no tracks. It was as if the children had simply vanished into the trees, leaving no trace of their passing beyond those disturbing prints around my tent. I should have left then. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to pack up and hike back to civilization. But my professional curiosity was stronger than my fear. If there were children in genuine distress somewhere in this wilderness, I had a responsibility to help them. So I spent that day exploring the area around the lake, looking for any sign of other campers, any explanation for what I'd been experiencing. I found nothing. No other tents, no fire rings, no evidence that anyone else had been in the area recently. But as afternoon faded to evening, I began to hear the children again. This time, they seemed to be playing a new game, hide and seek, from the sound of it, with one child counting while the others scattered to find hiding places. I could hear the counter's voice clearly. A young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, reciting the familiar litany. 1, 2, 3, 4. Her voice was sweet, innocent, exactly what you'd expect from a child at play, but she was counting far too slowly, with unnatural pauses between numbers, as if savoring each word. 5, 6, 7. I realized I was holding my breath, waiting for her to reach 10 and begin seeking. But she never got there. The counting would reach 8 or 9, then start over again, an endless loop of anticipation that never reached resolution. As darkness fell, more voices joined in, not hiding, but openly play around my campsite now, close enough that I should have been able to see them in my torch beam. Children running between the trees, laughing and calling to each other, their voices forming a circle around my fire. I sat frozen, torch in hand, swinging the beam back and forth, but never quite catching sight of the sources of the voices. Always just beyond the edge of illumination, always moving just as the light reached them. Dr. Hartwell, one of them called out, the same sweet girl's voice I'd heard counting. Will you play with us? Every professional instinct I possessed told me to respond, to engage with what might be children in need. But something deeper, more primitive, screamed at me to stay silent, to give no acknowledgement that I could hear them. We've been waiting so long for someone to play with. Another voice added, a boy this time, sounding perhaps 10 years old. The other grown-ups never want to play our games. Other grown-ups. The phrase sent ice to my veins. How many others had encountered these children? How many had tried to help and found something other than innocent play? We have such good games, a third voice chimed in. Games you can play forever and ever. The emphasis on forever was what finally broke my paralysis. I retreated to my tent and zipped it closed, trying to block out the sound of children at play that continued around me throughout the night. But fabric provides no barrier to sound, and the children seemed to know exactly where I was. Their games grew more elaborate and more complex, involving what sounded like dozens of participants. The voices multiplied until it seemed like an entire school playground had been transplanted to the forest around my tent. And underneath the play sounds, I began to hear other things. Whispered conversations about the new one, excited discussions of games I'd never heard of, plans for activities that made my skin crawl despite their innocent-sounding names. Dawn brought silence and a decision. I had to leave, had to get back to civilization, and figure out what I'd encountered. If there really were children lost in this wilderness, the authorities needed to be notified. If there weren't, well, that was a possibility I didn't want to contemplate. I broke camp quickly and started hiking back toward the trailhead. But as I walked, I began to notice that the trail looked different from what I remembered. Familiar landmarks were missing or in the wrong places. Turns that should have led downhill instead climbed upward. It was as if the forest itself had rearranged overnight. By midday, I was thoroughly lost. The trail had disappeared entirely, leaving me to navigate by compass through dense forest that grew thicker and darker with every step. And all around me, just beyond sight, I could hear the children following. They weren't trying to hide anymore. Their voices came from every direction, ahead of me, behind me, on both sides. Always just out of sight, but close enough that I could hear individual conversations, could make out the details of their games. Games that were becoming less innocent with every passing hour. "Let's play doctor," I heard one suggest. "Dr. Hartwell can be the patient." "Or we could play hide and seek," another added. "She can hide, and we'll seek her forever." "I know," said a third voice, bright with childish excitement. "Let's play house. She can be the mommy who never leaves." The implications of that last suggestion made me stumble. Nearly falling as the true nature of what I was dealing with finally became clear. These weren't lost children. They were something else, something that mimicked childhood but had never actually experienced it. Something that had been waiting in this forest for someone to claim, someone to add to their eternal games. I ran then, crashing through undergrowth and scrambling over fallen logs in my desperation to escape. But the children kept pace effortlessly, their laughter echoing from every direction, their games continuing around me as I fled. That's how I spent the next 2 days, running through a forest that seemed to have no boundaries, no exit, while invisible children played their twisted games just beyond my vision. I finished my water, ate the last of my food, but kept moving because stopping meant being caught, and being caught meant joining their permanent playground. On the 3rd day, exhausted and delirious, I stumbled onto a logging road, an actual road with tire tracks and the blessed sight of human machinery. I followed it for hours until I reached a ranger station, where I collapsed and tried to explain what had happened. The rangers were kind but skeptical. Search and rescue teams found no trace of children in the area I described. No missing person reports matched what I'd experienced. The official conclusion was that I'd become disoriented, possibly dehydrated, and had experienced hallucinations brought on by stress and isolation. I wanted to believe that explanation, desperately wanted to accept that my overtaxed mind had finally snapped and created an elaborate fantasy to process years of accumulated trauma from working with damaged children. But I brought something back with me from that forest, something that proves my experience was real. I can still hear them, not constantly, but at quiet moments when I'm alone. The sound of children playing, always just at the edge of perception. Laughter that follows me from room to room. Voices calling my name when I'm trying to sleep. And sometimes, late at night, I hear that sweet girl's voice starting her eternal count. 1, 2, 3, 4. She never reaches 10. The game never progresses beyond that anticipatory phase, that moment of preparation before the seeking begins. Because the seeking phase is what I escape from, what I'm still running from. They're still playing their games out there in Lolo Forest, still waiting for new players to join them, still counting down to a seeking phase that will last forever for anyone unlucky enough to be found. If you ever find yourself camping alone in remote wilderness, if you ever hear the sound of children playing where no children should be, don't investigate. Don't try to help. Don't engage with voices that sound too perfect, too consistently happy, too eager to include you in their games. Because some playmates never let you stop playing. Some games never end. And some children never grow up because they were never really children at all. The counting has started again. I can hear it drifting through my flat, that sweet, innocent voice beginning another endless sequence that will never reach its conclusion. 1, 2, 3. I think they found me again. I think the game has followed me home. 4, 5, 6. If you're listening to this, if I don't get a chance to finish this recording, remember what I've told you. Stay away from voices that call to you from dark forests. Stay away from games that promise to last forever. 7, 8. Because ready or not, they're always seeking. And once they find you, you can never stop playing. 9. The counting has stopped. I think it's time for the seeking to begin.